Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Attendance Bias. I am your host, Brian Weinstein. Today's guest, Matt Hoffman, takes us back to an instant classic, December 2nd, 1997, at the Philadelphia Spectrum. It was the first night of a two-night run that has since been released officially by Live Phish. The fall 1997 tour has been reviewed on Attendance Bias before, and also it's been reviewed on basically any other conversation about Phish. But today's discussion focuses more on the micro. This specific show at the Forum and Matt's experience seeing the band for the first time at their career peak. By this point of the tour, Phish was a well-oiled machine, and Philadelphia was as close to a hometown show for Trey as the band would get at the time. Donning a Flyers jersey for the show, Trey and the band would offer up a setlist full of fan favorites, including a 7-song second set. 5 of those songs would end up appearing on the Phish.net jamcharts. Meanwhile, there is a particular Philadelphia flavor to this conversation, as Matt grew up and still lives in the Philly area. So keep listening as we join Matt to talk about the Mann Music Center, cover bands, and taking naps as we discuss Phish's show from December 2nd, 1997 at the Spectrum. So Matt, welcome to Attendance Bias. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's good to be here.
I'm glad to have you here because you and I have been friends for about 20 years now, and Phish
Crazy.
for all that time, has been the connective tissue between us, but we've never really began to sat down and talk about specific details. We're always talking in generalities and especially about more recent shows. But today, you're here to talk about a 1.0 show, your first, December 2nd, 1997 at the legendary Spectrum in Philadelphia, PA, not the center, the Spectrum.
Old school. That's right. I forget exactly when they took that down as they were making the other stadiums. But yes, I do and will always have fond memories of the Spectrum. Have some complaints, but we don't need to talk about those.
But before we get to anything involving Phish, Matt, you're the author of the blog To Nap Divine, as well as several other bits and pieces of independent journalism. Matt, where can people find your work and what will they find when they get there?
So I appreciate you asking. I keep everything at my website and on socials. All of it is To Nap Divine. Long story short, that starts from a blog that I started writing last year as I was transitioning to, and this makes more sense with the benefit of hindsight, transitioning into doing more of this kind of writing than the sort of corporate work I had spent the 20 or so years prior to that doing. To Nap Divine, it was about napping loosely, very long story short. And we've got that content linked out on my site, but on my site is where I'm doing a lot of my independent writing now. But really, most of the writing I'm doing right now has been for Jambase and Relics and a few other non-music related publications. But I'm trying to keep all of that information on the site.
Great. So it's tonapdivine.com. Is that right?
Yes, T-O Nap Divine. To sleep is human, to nap divine.
I got to tell you, man, I am not a good napper. I do not like to nap. I'd rather go to sleep at 8 p.m. than nap at 4 p.m. and stay up a little bit later. I wake up disoriented. I feel like I have to do my morning routine. Like I have to get in the shower, I have to brush my teeth after waking up, even from a nap, even though I already did my morning routine.
I would submit to you, I won't tell you you're doing it wrong, but I will ask. We'll take this conversation offline, but I've got a number of napping cheat codes I'd be glad to recommend to you after maybe diagnosing what I would describe as the problem, because napping is awesome.
Then let's get into the attendance bias lightning round.
Attendance bias lightning round.
Matt, we kind of answered this first question halfway. It's when was your first show, which you answered, but what do you remember most from it?
A few different things. So I was 17 at the show. My dad knew some people with the organization, so he was able to get 4 tickets for me and a few friends to go to the show. We sat in a box rather than, in the seat. So it was different than every other show I've been to in that regard. But I just remember kind of walking the lots beforehand with my friends, seeing some people I know, seeing a lot that I didn't. And in terms of the show itself, I just never seen anything like that before. Like I had been into different kinds of music, had been to a lot of different shows, and I hadn't even listened to enough Phish to be dangerous, I would say, at that point. Um, but I'd listened to enough that I was intrigued and wanted to go. And I know that we're gonna go, set by set, but when they opened with Buried Alive, I'm just like, what the heck is going on right now? And they went into Disease, which I knew, and I play the guitar, so just watching what Trey was doing and seeing the lights and all of that, it's a lot of more kind of mental snapshots and emotions than anything else. And it was really cool. And now, 30 or so years later, seeing the set list, I get to enjoy it a little differently, where it's like, oh wow, I saw a weird dog face boy in the middle of a show. Like, that's kind of cool.
What was your most recent show, and what did you think of it?
My recent show was the Man Music Center, which is not far from me in the Philly Burbs. On, I want to say it was 7/26 of last year. And
2023.
it was cool. Yes, 2023. Thank you. And it was cool because I was there with some people I know. I was there with a friend where it was his first Phish show, and it's like, hey, it's not my responsibility to. There's only so much I can do to make it a good show for him. Like, let's see how the band does. And the band showed up in spades. Like, they threw a Boogie on Reggae Woman right at the end, like in the middle of Mike's. Mike's was the opener of the first set. Then they came back and completed the groove, and there were just some really great jams there at the show, and it was just such a great experience and show. That all was exciting, but it's mostly that kind of first Mike's groove and seeing them bust out an old trick by just doing something different by virtue of how they structure the set list, as compared with a lot of the other tricks that have been amazing that they've developed over the years. It's cool to see them kind of bust out a standard.
When it comes to the Man specifically, where is your ideal ticket? Are you in the pit? Do you want to be in the reserve seats? Do you want to be in the terrace, or do you want to be on the lawn?
I would want to be in the pit typically. I somehow managed to get pit tickets years ago. It was actually one of my first dates with my wife. We went to see Dawes and M Ward and Bright Eyes. We were really there for Dawes, but it was a great show. And like fourth row, there's just kind of nothing like that. For a Phish show, I haven't sat down there, but I like to watch what the folks are doing, and seeing it in person is kind of the way for me. Beyond that, there is between the pit and then the first level of seats, that's my next preferred area because I think the sound there is better than in the rest of the place, even though, according to legend, the Man has been designed so there's not a bad seat in the house. I just find that it sounds directionally like it sounds better the closer you are to the stage. And as you get farther away, like I'd rather just be on the lawn after that.
Well, since we're in the Philadelphia mindset, since the Spectrum has been gone for a while now, all else being equal, what is your favorite Philadelphia music venue?
Well, so I won't give the lawyer answer that it depends. All in all, right now, Ardmore Music Hall is my favorite spot. They get great bands who I feel like in the life cycle of a band, and you've been in bands, you've seen this, over time you hope to play bigger venues. So to oversimplify, like given the size of the space, you've got little bands who are coming up, or you've got bands who've already kind of made it and they're maxing out that space. And like I'd imagine, I don't know for sure, but I'd imagine that say Goose played that space at one point early on in their career, post pandemic, maybe even pre. I'm not the smartest Goose history guy in the world, but it's just cool because I like seeing different bands, and inevitably, as a band in this scene is coming up, they're going to make their way through Ardmore before they get to the Tower, the Fillmore, the Factory. It's the Franklin Music Hall now, and also just their management and their staff are awesome. I really think highly of them personally. They also make for a great experience. So there are other things I like about different places, but if you ask me right now, Ardmore's the place to be. It's also right near an excellent brewery called Tired Hands.
So to get a picture of you as a bigger fan than just Phish, your musical profile of you, What band do you think that you've seen live the most other than Phish?
Well, I mean, the answer is Jimmy Buffett. Like, if my first Phish show was December '97, my first Buffett show was sometime in the summer of '98. Just fantastic scene. I like a lot of the tunes, and even for the ones that are never going to make my Mount Rushmore of favorite music, which, frankly, is most of them. Like, I like the tunes, I like the crowd and the experience, etc. And it's funny because I ran into somebody. I was at the this Grateful Dead Unlimited Devotion kind of festival celebration out at Ardmore last weekend. Ran into somebody. We were talking, and they're like, "Oh, do you like Phish?" I said, "Yeah." When did you see him? How long? How many shows, etc. And I was like, "Oh, December '97." And he's like, "Oh, my first show was, spring '98 or something like that." And he was like, "Yeah, I've been to like 350 shows." And I said, "Oh, I've been to like between 20 and 30." And he's like, "See, I guess you don't like them a lot." And it's like, "No, I really like them and a lot about them." And the way that I happen to do that can be satisfied by listening to a lot of recordings, particularly as I get older. I kind of lose some steam to be able to, stay out late like I used to. There have been plenty of opportunities for me to see him, and there continue to be. Just having a family, it's much less now. And I guess over the years, it was shows that got me through. My freshman year of college was when Napster started to become a thing. And beyond that, it's just become easier and easier as we've gone from tape trading to the web.
I agree. And it also goes the other way, where you're saying as you get older or more familial responsibilities come around, that it gets harder to go to shows, which I'm sure is an experience that almost any of my listeners can probably relate to. It also works from the beginning forward, because I also saw Phish for the first time in December 1997, and I had just turned 15 years old. So when they were touring, first of all, they didn't come back to New York for a long time, because when they played Madison Square Garden, they kind of stayed away to build up the demand for a while. And also, I didn't have a car. And at 15, I wasn't getting on a train, to go to a different state. I wasn't rolling in the money, even though Phish was fairly affordable at that time. It's just not that you can't go now. It's that I also couldn't go at the beginning. So there's
Yeah.
it's always kind of, I don't know if impressive is the right word, but it certainly says something about someone when they drop a name or a number like 300 shows. Sure, but you don't judge the dedication of a fan by the number of shows that they've seen. I think that's like judging a pitcher by his record. A pitcher could be the greatest pitcher in the world, but has the worst defense and the worst offense on his team. So he has a losing record. It's not fair.
Well, I also find that with a show that you see, that's kind of the whole concept of attendance bias, right? Like, I'm not listening as intently to a show that I am at than a show that I'm listening to, on my own. I think in part that's also because my attention span can come and go. So it's helpful for me to be able to hear these tunes more, like really kind of internalize the jams. Like, there are some details about this show that I know we're going to talk about. It's just that kind of stuff is cool to me, and I totally missed it in the moment. So, again, for me, just given the way that I like to listen to the band, listening to recordings, does it for me. But to be fair, every show I've been to has been great. It's just been a great time. The music sort of does what it does, as you know. Sometimes there are some shows that are generally considered better than others, but it's always a good time from my perspective.
To wrap it all up, what is the weirdest thing you've ever seen at a Phish show?
I guess technically this was between shows, in that I saw Phish in Camden on the last show of the tour prior to Coventry. Left the show from Camden, rode up to North Jersey with some buddies. Camden's in South Jersey near Philly. Rode up to North Jersey. We got on the road just to drive straight to Coventry, and we're just making great time, and we felt like we got away with something, almost like, oh, this is going to be fantastic. And that was true until we got like 5 to 10 miles from there and just hit the line of cars and just got out of the car, and everybody was just kind of hanging out there for a while, and we hitched rides and whatever. Like, that was kind of a revelation to me, not having been to a whole lot of festivals prior to that. That was the weirdest thing. That's the thing I can remember about my Phish experience that felt the weirdest at the time, which may not be as weird as some other stuff I've seen at other shows over the years, but like we've been talking about this offline. Like the community aspect of the scene has been so much on my mind lately, and that was probably one of the earliest instances of that for me, where I'm sitting in an RV, but you get bored there when you're there for however many hours, and you just walk around and go sit in somebody else's RV, unless they tell you not to, and that's fine. It's just nice. And I met a bunch of people who I've never talked to before or since, to my knowledge, wish them really well. And like that's kind of a cool thing about the community, like the different ways that you can cross paths with people.
Yeah, absolutely. So you did not take Trey's advice at the encore of
No,
that Camden show
no,
where
I
he
didn't.
said, "Don't head up, don't go straight there."
Ah, I didn't. I didn't love the encore, so I was probably like not in the greatest headspace at that time. But either way, like the plan was the plan, and knowing the way my friends and I kind of thought at that point, it's like, well, that'll deter people, so we'll go there and it'll be great. And it's like, we'll go there and it will be great, but we're not going to make it all the way. So we're going to do some walk-in, and we hitched the truck on the way back, and life lesson, listen to Trey, I guess.
When was this show played?
So today's show, December 2nd, 1997, was part of the fall 1997 tour, which is arguably the best known and, at least maybe among our age cohort, the most fondly remembered tour of Phish's career thus far. So much about this tour has been said, written, discussed, whether it's on podcasts, including this one, in books, online, and of course among fan discussions in parking lots, etc., that there's really no way that we can add a lot of insight to it, in my opinion, except for this singular show. So when I think of Fall 97, the first thing that comes to my mind is Cow Funk, right? It gets a lot of the headlines when people think of 1997, or at least Fall 97. There's also Europe 97, of course, earlier in the year, but it was
Mm-hmm.
also spread out and more democratic jamming. There was a lot more space. People for a Louder Mic, if you remember that, and a batch of new
Mm-hmm.
songs debuted either earlier during the Summer 97 tour or on this one. And it also seems, in retrospect, if you're talking about a legacy, that nearly every stop on this tour has gained a legacy on its own, whether it's a pair of shows or a singular show, and as part of the Fall 97 tour. So it seems like every show on this tour has its story and its proponents of people who say that was the best one of the 97 tour. So I'm more familiar with this show, not this one, but the night after, December 3rd. That's the one I had the tapes of. I never had the tapes for the second, but this show, as well as the next night, so both nights, were officially released by Phish as recently as March 2024 as a 6 CD box set, which I thought was unusual to, in 2024, release new music as CDs.
Mm-hmm.
It's described on Live Phish as, quote, two formative nights of Phish during their fall 1997 apex, and it's also called a standout run. So we'll get to it later, but Ghost, which I really love on this show, is described by Live Phish as an electro-funk dance party. And also the speed of Chalk Does Torture is highlighted on the livefish.com description of this release.
The speed of this show is definitely something that occurred to me, and as I was listening to it, and we'll talk about it as we get through the specific songs. I'm curious, right? Like, because I've talked to some younger people who got into Phish just because they're younger than me, later than me. A lot of them seen way more shows, whatever. But if guys like us in our 40s think Fall 97 is one of the most, it's just awesome, right? I'm not going to compare it to other eras. Like, what do you find that people who sort of came on board in 2.0 or in 3.0 are pointing to as the time? Like, is it a time that they've seen? Is there maybe some attendance bias there? Or are they looking back and saying, like, no, it's not Fall 97. It was the European tour, Summer 97, which I love, by the way. They did a Yamar in a club there where Trey would. Have you heard the show where it's in, I don't know, the Netherlands, where like Trey is calling out specific mini jams in it where it's like, okay, you know, cause symbol and Rhodes, and like Page jumps over to the Rhodes and Phish jumps over and he's hitting that one symbol, and then it's like guitar and drums and they do something, and then he's like foot stomping and everybody in the place is stomping their feet. It's just like it's such a wonderful Phish moment.
Yeah.
So you back to the question, like, what do you find that fans from different eras say are what we say about Fall 97?
And it's interesting. That's a really good question. Generally, I can't not think of one time I was speaking to a member of Dark Star Orchestra, and one of my questions for him, or it was like each member of Dark Star, but they all gave the same answer. It's very funny. I said, "What is your favorite era of the Grateful Dead?" And all of them said the late 80s.
Hmm.
And it wasn't as a group. Each one of them said individually, apart from one another. And then Rob Eaton, who for years has been the Bob Weir role of that band, he said generally he thinks that as far as the Grateful Dead goes, people will always cite the time that they got into the band as what they think is the favorite time period of the band. With Phish, I think that's partly true, but Phish has such a wider history than the Grateful Dead. And what I mean by that is by now, they've been playing for 10 years longer than the Grateful Dead ever did. So Phish has 10 more years on top of it, which is 10 more years of new fans, 10 more years of new sounds. I think that it's an axiom. I think it's true. I think people tend to say that the time they got into the band is their favorite. But, and also younger fans, or newer fans, I should say, not necessarily younger, tend to revolt against what are usually seen as generic axioms of Phish. So if you and I say, oh, well, obviously 1.0 is the best, someone who got into Phish in 2016 or the Baker's Dozen was their first experience with Phish might say, like, yeah, okay, old. Not
Yeah.
necessarily that sarcastic way, but they might say, yeah, maybe, but I'm going to listen to what I like.
Like it just becomes opinion, and everybody's entitled to have them and have them for whatever reasons they have them. I loved being contrary when I was in my teens and 20s, but they played Fall 97 then, and attendance bias or not, that was a great era.
But speaking of
Interesting. What
97, of Fall 97, December 2nd, the show that we're talking about today, what led you there? What's your Phish origin story and what led you to this show?
So in terms of Phish origin story, I remember I worked as like a counselor at a summer camp, when I was a teenager. And one summer in '95, this guy was talking about Phish and, really wanted to play some tape or CD or something. And I was like, what the heck is this? I don't know what to make of it. Then a few years, maybe the next year, just driving to school with different people, like the person who drove us played a live one a lot. So I just listened to it a lot. And it's like, oh, I actually really like this. And then by the time Fall 97 came around, I was enough of a fan that I just decided I wanted to go. And, where I live now is near where I grew up. And given what my dad for a living, he worked with a company that did security for the stadiums. So was able to get me tickets. I think he got them. I think John Langenstein, it would make sense because John's the head of security, or was. Yeah, John was the nicest guy in the world, gave him 4 tickets. I took 3 friends, and ironically, or maybe not, I haven't spoken to those friends in a very long time. Such is the nature of your life and anybody's life as you're a Phish fan, right? Like the band changes and you change. And, that was where I was at in fall of 97.
Set 1.
Well, let's get into the show. As you've mentioned a few times, they open with Buried Alive. And I've said it on this podcast before. I'll say it now. I'll say it again in the future. Whenever they open with Buried Alive, it's a good sign of what's to come whenever it opens the show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder, because I don't know exactly, and you may have insight into this, like how Trey's kind of planning a set, has worked. I know that there's a lot of stuff he just kind of calls from the stage. Sometimes they do beforehand. So, of course, I'm not going to have insight into how they decide the song order on any given night, but I totally agree. Well, so actually, I'm currently in Woodstock, New York. I'm going to see this band Reprise that is doing the Dark Star thing for Phish, and they're playing 12/3/97, which opened with Buried Alive. So I'm like, fuck yeah, it's gonna be great.
This is perfect pre-show conversation.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And 12/3 was my brother's first show, and 12/3 was the one that I saw last night in Philly. So lot of nostalgia here.
So after Buried Alive, at the very end, it ends with a lot of feedback. It's almost the whole last minute of the track, and it feeds directly into Down with Disease, which is, to me at least, a tentpole of 1997, even though it debuted, one could argue, on New Year's Eve 93, but really came into its own in 1994. But for me, these fall 1997 Down with Diseases, there's something about them. Like, Page almost always begins the jam with a piano. Fishman keeps the beat up tempo, but he's not too fast. He's focusing very much on the cymbals. And Mike and Trey are kind of huddling together before we get to that 97 trademark sound with this guitar-led tension and release around 6 minutes. It's only a minor peak, but we're still at the start of the show before Trey gets fully into the wah-wah pedal. You forget People for a Louder Mic. People for a Louder bass drum must have gotten their hands on this mix. I listened to the audience recording because Mike and Fishman's bass drum are just driving this whole jam, and I love it.
Oh, that's interesting. I listened to the version that they just released. I just remember, and I noticed this more, listening later. I don't know that this was the tightest show ever, just in terms of like clubs. Because I think in this one it sounds like Mike starts it in E. I don't know if he had like a bass tuning issue, if he was playing with the 5 string or had to go to drop D or whatever. But yeah, like there were some clubs where like if I'm imagining the guys on the stage, I'd be like, Mike, what are you doing? Like, what song are we playing here? I mean, I totally agree with everything that you said about the jam. Like for me as a guitar player, this is probably just the intro to the lead or to the solo is like one of my favorite licks of all time. Like it's just genius. And getting to see it live and then the subsequent jam, like, Buried Alive was wonderful, but it was short. Like, this experience kind of led me into my first real kind of Phish moment, as far as obviously something that's a big part of what they do. And it just blew me away. Like, just watching Trey play and hearing the interplay across the band, yeah, it stayed with me.
Yeah, and 1997, I know I mentioned it, a big year for Down with Disease. It really expanded. When I talked earlier about playing with a lot of space, Down with Disease was kind of their go-to after they were done with the song proper and they drop into that jam. And speaking of playing with a lot of space, there's an amazing segue at the end of Down with Disease into Makisupa Policeman, which to me was very unexpected. If you're not looking at the set list or if you don't know the show, it feels like the whole bottom just drops out.
Yeah, and it was like it's such a spacey Makasupa in parts too. And I thought it was funny that it was a song where they talk about pot when I was 17 and, knew that they would say a different word at that point. I mean, there are a bunch of left turns in this show, which I think was pretty on brand for them, certainly through the mid to late 90s, between this and some of the other tunes we're going to talk about later, and over time, more of that kind of ambient or spacier music has just become something I've gotten more and more into listening to and making. So it's cool now to hear, at some point they're like, all right, we're just going to kind of make some sounds for a bit and see where this goes. And clearly, by the time we get to Chalk Dust, the next track, they had some juice left in them to go nuts. But I just really dug, like, talking about the jam and disease, which is a big part of what they do. This just kind of went to that place in space, and it was really cool.
The spaciness of their style in 1997, allowing each other the space, chalked as torture. It was mentioned on Live Phish, and I wrote in my first notes, this is fast, 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 all in capital letters. I thought the first minute was like when you listen to a podcast at 1.5 speed just to get through it.
For the price of a flag and a price, the wind busts the cannon. You speak of your life, or more willingly notice the light.
Oh, absolutely. And there were a few times in this show that, like, Trey in particular seemed to be really kind of driving the pace of the show. And I forget what the show was. It was Camden, either 98 or 99 over the summer, where they had that just like really weird chalk dust that they totally stretched out and took to some weird places. So I guess I had some pretty early luck with Phish in terms of chalk dusts. But I think that was really the first song at the show where, like, the just different peaks and chalk dust as Trey really gets way up high on the neck and is hitting these high notes, and the crowd is just, loving it and freaking out. Like, it's different than so like Van Halen, for example, was still one of my favorite bands, and they were my favorite band going into this. People are like cheering, when Eddie rips a solo or something like that, or ripped a solo, but it's not the same because it's all kind of expected. He's not exactly going to play the same thing, but it's going to look, a little different. And with this, like, you don't totally know what's going to happen. So I just remember seeing everybody kind of really, feeling what they were doing on the stage and seeing how it's almost like everybody in the crowd's like, they're not high-fiving, but everybody is kind of getting what's going on. That just really, really blew me away.
I understand why, because I'm not usually impressed by crazy guitar fireworks, as I call them, like whether it's Trey or any other guitarist like Eddie Van Halen. And that's not a slight, it's just my taste. But
Sure.
this version of Chalk Dust was very invigorating, largely because of Trey and his playing. And I know that we were only 4 songs in, but to me, this was a very obvious show highlight, anointed as it would be, right in the beginning of the show before another show highlight, Ghost.
It's just so cool. Like even thinking now about what Ghost has become, thinking back on this era and listening to this Ghost in particular, it's just like it's so fun to look back and see them figuring it out and just doing so much cool shit, like Electro Funk Dance Party or whatever it was called. That's it, man. That was it. It moved, and I just loved it. That's another show highlight for me.
Yeah, I wondered right when they started it, I thought that, wow, holy shit, this is funky. And then I had the question, was Fall 1997 made for Ghost or was Ghost made for Fall 97? Like it just matches so well. Like this is the song in its place, in its time. And Ghost, I know, has had miraculous versions outside of 1997, obviously, but this just seems to be its comfort zone, its place. And this version, it's kind of fast. It has some get up and go energy to it. Like I know some people who found Cal Funk boring and repetitive because to be honest, I could see where they're coming from. You could listen to 5 shows from Fall 97. You kind of know where each song is going to go in a way, all the different effects within listening to 2 or 3 shows. So it has to be original on approach. And to me it is, but I could understand how so many fans didn't like it, but it must have opened so many ears to different types of music.
And part of what I appreciate about Fall 97 and really a lot of the 1.0 stuff, I mean, definitionally, you wouldn't have any of the other stuff without Fall 97, but it's just cool that like they took these tunes and really just leaned into that style. And Trey is using the wah in a way that really is supportive of it. To your point, like there have been so many phenomenal Ghosts outside of that, and more recently, and I won't count Say It To Me Santos, whether that's the same song in a different key, though I love Santos. Yeah, like the way that they started off with it couldn't have been a better way to start, in my view. And it's also cool to see what that platform turned into over time.
Absolutely. And as amazing as Trey's rhythm playing, and you mentioned the wah-wah pedal, is evocative of this time period and is used extremely well on Ghost, it should not be ignored that, and with all due respect to Page, that Fishman and Mike are really the ones holding it together. They're playing almost minimalist rhythm section compared to what we're used to them playing.
That stood out to you as you listened to this? Is that because you just haven't found them to do that much more since Fall 97 at all? What made that stand out to you?
Well, 2 things on that. I think that they can do that, and they do still play it that way since Fall 97. I think right now, as we're speaking in 2024, Phish is, I'll be one of those guys who says they're as good as they've ever been because they take this sound of funk, and before that, crazy arena rock in 1995, let's say, and then speed jazz in 1992. And they have access to all these different playing styles in their back pocket that they've now kind of like cubist Phish, that they could look at the same song or the same jam from all these different angles and they're recognizable, but it's never the same. So I love that. The reason that it caught my attention on this listen, especially, is I honestly think because of the tone of the instruments. Fishman really sounds like he's playing in a small club with the very tight, tappy snare drum that he has. In addition to the fact that Mike was very openly experimenting with his bass sound at the time. So when you have the drums and the bass matching up and the whole band is influenced by funk, it's going to make itself obvious.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like when I listen to early to mid 95 shows, so 93 to 95, Fishman's drums to me just sound like such a like locomotive, runaway train, which is funny because I feel like at a few times he was a little behind Trey during this show, but it just sounds like I don't know if they started making them differently or if he started using different gear or whatever it was. But I'd say by the time we get to 96, like his sound, I mean, it evolves over time, but it gets a little bit closer to what I think of as the Fishman sound now. Again, maybe it's by virtue of the recording stuff just changing and getting better. But yeah, it's interesting to me to hear you say that. But you're more plugged into that stuff, as a drummer, I'd say, than I am, just like I'm talking about chords and gear with Trey.
Yeah, but it's also playing to new venues. When
Hmm.
you're playing on a drum set and you're playing a literal arena, you have to pause a little bit and play a little bit slower for the echo for the sound to bounce off the back of the arena. Like I guess the back being the farthest point from the stage, and then echo back at you, so you're not overplaying. So he also had to
And
kind of slow himself down.
interesting. I haven't played a big arena yet, so I'll keep that in mind when I do.
If you ever sit right behind the stage at a Phish show, you'll hear it. Trust me, it's
Oh,
got to take practice. And at the end, these last 2 minutes of Ghost, they're doing this back and forth between muted strumming that Trey became a very big fan of during this time and drums
mhm.
for about 2 minutes going back and forth. And then they go into Divided Sky, which now would be called a ripcord because they just stop the whole jam and Trey starts up Divided Sky. And it's pretty normal with big theatrics reminding us that Fall 97 wasn't only about funk, that Phish was as tight and searing and as good at Machine Gun Trey crazy rock as they'd ever be. But still, I have to admit, while I was listening to Divided Sky, my head was still in the Ghost Jam.
I hear you, man. The one thing that really jumped out at me on re-listening to this recently had to do with the speed. Like this was the first tune where I noticed that Trey and Fish sounded a little bit out of sync, which seems funny to think about in 2024, just given. I mean, and not to say that Trey Fish thing wasn't a thing then, but there's just so much more time, and it's had so much more time to evolve. It's funny to hear to hear them be a little bit kind of out of sync from each other. I don't feel like it's something I hear a ton anymore.
Oh yeah, I agree. After Divided Sky, there's Dirt, which is a classic, 1997 Cool Down. I looked it up. They played it 20 times that year, especially heavy during the European and American summer tour. So to me, Dirt is of 1997. I know it debuted, but I also, because it was like we were discussing earlier, when your first shows that you over listened to are encoded as part of you, to me, it was played at my first show. So to me, Dirt is reminiscent of Fall 97.
Yeah, yeah. Dirt, like, I don't know if it's a bathroom break song for some people or whatever, but it's a nice song. I have a special place in my heart for it because I played it to audition for like a music show I was with in law school. So, but yeah, short of that, I like the transition, the way that they kind of transitioned into Taste from Dirt. Dirt was nice. Like, again, notwithstanding my, sort of nitpicking about Trey and Phish, I mean, Taste was another place where it felt like Trey was trying to pull Phish along to such an extent that I think Phish even had to like stop playing for half a measure and come back in. And, I mean, hey, that's what the band does, right? Like, one person veers off, everybody kind of adjusts accordingly. But well, sorry, I know we were talking about Dirt, but I just transitioned into Taste.
No, of course. It comes next. It's natural. And it is, I thought that there was a nice intro from Dirt, and the flow of this whole show so far, setlist wise, is really on point. And what grabbed my ears again during this Taste is Fishman's bass drum, which held everything together. To just jump off what you said about other members of the band maybe playing a little ahead, a little behind, I thought Fishman was rock solid during this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I need to see if I can find that audience recording to really catch some of those nuances.
And the set is over. We're already there. They close with the Star Spangled Banner because they played it, or sang it, I should say, a cappella the night before for the Flyers game. So to me, I don't think anyone would complain if Taste ended the set, but this is kind of my upbringing coming out where it's like, well, may as well bust this one out because we learned it for the previous night's Flyers game. Why bother practicing it if you're only going to do it once? I hear my grandma speaking.
And well, I hear you. And like, hey, nobody's ever going to say Star Spangled Banner is the favorite song they've ever heard Phish play necessarily. Well, I can't say nobody because you can't prove a negative. Like, it was cool for me because I knew, given how little I knew about the band at the time, I knew that like vocal jams and doing songs a cappella were a thing. So I felt privileged to get to see that. That just brings to mind another random memory where you mentioned the Flyers game. I think Trey was wearing a Flyers jersey to the show. I don't know if he ever wore one again to a Philly show, but during the 30th anniversary tour in '03, I was at that show at the Spectrum as well. And that's where some of my complaints come from. But again, we'll save that for April Fools.
Same.
Yes. Oh, you were there?
Oh, yeah. That's November 29th, 2003. It was arguably the most forgettable Phish show I've seen.
It's up there. It's up there for me. But I remember they showed, like that 30th anniversary video they kind of pieced together from other videos. And I remember they just like interspersed this little blurb from a newscast where some guy, some reporter is backstage at the Spectrum talking about like, oh, look at these pictures of rock stars who've played here. And they got to the picture of Trey and it's like, and look at Eric Clapton here wearing a Flyers jersey playing the Spectrum.
Hi, everybody. Brian here to welcome you to the set break of today's episode of Attendance Bias. First, thank you for listening. And second, just a quick reminder to tell you that even though Attendance Bias comes to you for free, it does take a lot of work and it does take quite a bit of money to keep the lights on here at production. So I just wanted to ask a small favor if you could support the podcast in any number of the following ways. If you could leave a review or a rating of it on whichever podcast app you use. If you could spread the word, telling a friend or someone you think may be interested in it about it. Or probably the most concrete way is to go to www.buymeacoffee.com/attendancebias and donate however much you can financially to help with the continuing costs of Attendance Bias. So thank you again so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the second half of today's episode.
Set 2.
Set 2 opens with Mike's song, and wow, 20 minutes plus, 20-minute mics to open set 2. Like, they're not fucking around here. The jam starts with cool synth noises that I thought were teased during Maki Suba Policeman, and I know they've been played throughout the tour at this point. And Page is kind of dominant. He's playing the organ, but no one really stood out. But this mic's kind of went all over the place. It got kind of low key. Trey switches to rhythm guitar, which is not surprising. Everyone in the band latches on, joins in. And then there's a rock funk cross at about 12 minutes where they play rhythm games with each other, especially Trey and Phish, before everyone gets quiet. And Fishman very delicately keeps the beat. This is a jam that if someone who was getting into Phish and they like the songs, I would say, all right, your next step is to listen to some of their jams. This is one I would offer.
Oh yeah, I mean, and really the jamming in the second set of this show jumps out at me. Like as you mentioned, you know, like the jazz shred era and these various other eras of Phish. I just think of them doing jams that sounded interesting to me, which maybe is just by virtue of the kind of stuff they were practicing. You know, like presumably, I mean, hey, they were doing jazz covers in the late '80s, early '90s, like if they're listening to a lot of jazz and Trey's practicing Donna Lee or something like that, that kind of stuff is going to come out more during the improvisation. Just personally, even beyond the funk piece of it, I just really like how they took these jams and where they went to, you know, call it kind of feeling wise through the notes they played and the way they played them. Like that just really makes my brain happy. I love this, Mike's. I love it.
too. And is this the sort of jam that you can just access in your head, that if you got in the car and turned on Phish radio, for example, on Sirius XM, and they were playing the middle of this jam, I'm sure you'd be able to identify it before looking at what track is being played, right?
Oh yeah, I could tell you when in the jam it is. Like I know this one. I know this one well.
And right after that segment, they kind of do a rock swing segment at 18 minutes. And my first thought on the notes, because I write just as I listen, I wrote they're just jamming without much direction or tension and release, just playing for fun, like you might in someone's basement or garage or something. And then I had to take it back because a minute later, at 19 minutes, it just goddamn rocks again and finds its way into simple. So Mike's into simple, classic pairing, but this is high up, top shelf jamming.
Oh yeah, and I mean to that point you had made earlier, like in my head, just the way they go from that rocking in one key and just kind of slide back a bit where Trey hangs out on the F. That's what I expect when you're going into simple, or the way that, Page plays some octave stuff on the keys on the alive one simple. It's just, I think I read somewhere once that the music you listen to when you're 19 winds up being the music that really stays with you over time. For me, this was a 97 show, like I was 17, so it's close enough. But yeah, I mean, I love the simple. I love the kind of space, some of the psychedelia, etc. And just, sort of little personal nuance or quirk, I guess, is that I always expect the simple to kind of start that way, even though they rarely do, but it was perfect.
I wonder if you also expect it to end this way, because it kind of gets quiet and then it's a spacey psychedelic outro for 3 minutes. Like they weren't in a rush to go anywhere for a long time. It's mostly kind of a frantic duet between Page and Trey that lands on Dog-Faced Boy of all songs. And this is what we touched on before. I had no idea. This is the only Dog-Faced Boy that's on the Phish.net jam charts, and rightfully so. It's a beautiful introduction. It's very heavy on piano and finger picking. It almost sounds like the Lizards.
Yeah, and it's like a little faster, or probably a good bit faster than the typical Dog-Faced Boys you're going to hear. I mean, right, going like the way that they went from Mike's into simple, getting into Dog-Faced Boy, from what Trey and Page have been doing together. I don't know how much of that was them just kind of figuring it out on stage, and that was what they were doing during the ambience and the space or whatever it was. But when I think about certain kinds of songs, like if the quintessential Dog-Faced Boy is the one that they had on, I think, Hoist.
Yes,
you know
it's
better
on
than me.
Hoist.
Like, yeah, then that's going to be, and Hoist was also the first album I got into, so there's probably some equivalent of attendance bias there. Like, it's just different. Like, you don't hear ones like this, and I thought that was pretty cool. And agreed, they just approached it really nicely. Like, they're kind of cooling down a little bit after the paces they've put themselves and us through already, and I really enjoyed it.
Going to put my oxygen for the guy who's turning blue. But ask me, and I'll do anything for you. Whenever I think of you, it only makes me feel sad. Whenever I think of you, the best friend I ever had. Before I give it all for nothing.
And then the way they segue it right into Yamar, which is another one of my favorite kind of songs to hear live. Like they were just on. It was fantastic.
Yeah, that segue into Yamar is quite smooth. And I thought this has to be in a different key, right? Like it's very impressive that they're really speeding ahead. They're driving like 120 down the highway and they could just maneuver around everything. Like they start playing it and the whole band joins in just 30 seconds in. And it kind of reminds me of a version in 1996. I think it's November 2nd, 96 with Carl Perazzo on auxiliary percussion. And there's a rare drum break in it with Trey playing along with muted strums. Like this rules. This is like a jazz calypso mix, which I've never said before.
Huh. Yeah, it's cool. I talked about that summer 97 Yamar. Like I just liked the way that they were playing that song in this era. I think Paige or Trey like directs Mike to kind of take a jam at some point in the tune. It's a nice little bass solo as Trey again is just kind of doing that, like, scraping or like muted. I guess muted picking is what you'd call it on that. What I'm talking about. But it's super duper cool. And then they just pick it up and like next thing you know, Trey the head cutter is out there just going all machine gun style, or at least like a little bit. I mean, look, if you got it and the spirit moves you, why not? But I dug it.
Well, yeah, I don't say that a lot or say this a lot about 97 Phish, especially, but I even wrote that there's kind of a Pete Townsend guitar style where Trey is the rhythm of the song because Fishman is all over the high pitched toms that he has.
Yeah,
and Trey's
it's
Trey's
cool.
the one holding it together. Fishman gets to be Trey for a little bit. And it was really fun to listen to before they tease Cross-Eyed and Painless. Like this Yamar has everything. And then it gets down and dirty in the last minute before segueing into Weekapog.
Yeah, the other thing I remember, and I don't remember it from the show, but I remember it from like show notes in the past. They talk about like Trey's grandpa, instead of he was a good old pie. It was my grandpa.
Yep.
Because I think his grandpa must have been there at the show because they're from Princeton, or Trey's from Princeton, which isn't any more than like an hour or so from Philly. I just thought that was funny and calls him Grand Pooty, which is, I mean, I called my grandparents goofy names too. So I just thought it was sweet. It's like the little reminders you get every now and again that these are just guys I love that stuff.
But yes, after Yamar, they go into Weekapog Groove to close the Mike's Groove Suite. It's still, in the words that I wrote down, still has the dust of Yamar for the first minute or so, especially for the drum beat before it slides into place for Weekapog. Paige gets down on clavinet. Like I just know he was standing up during
Oh,
it. It just
absolutely.
so funky and it speeds up. Like you want to talk about patience. Fish could have forced this speed up earlier in the jam, but they played the song for like a whole 6 minutes with a compelling jam until the opportunity presented itself to speed up. And then, holy shit, at 9 minutes, I just wrote hose, hose, hose. Where did this hard rock come from?
Yeah, I mean, I think consistent with what we've been talking about for like this show has everything, and a lot of the individual songs in the show have everything or have a lot, right? Like you've got Paige kind of giving us some clav funk. A little bit later, like you said, like a little bit later they kind of pick it up and get there. Like it was just cool. It's like cool to see them, busting stuff out from their bag of tricks in terms of what that looked like in 1997. Just like they've continued to bust out other tricks, since they've as they've evolved and changed gear and styles and the tech evolves, etc. It's just cool to see them like really using all the tools in their toolbox during a lot of the songs and certainly throughout most of the show.
The next song, Bouncing Around the Room, every other song in this set. So that's Mike's, Simple, Dogface Boy, Yamar, Weekapog, and then Bouncing Around the Room. They're all on the jam charts except for Bouncing Around the Room. Oh, and Character Zero, which closes it.
Good God, we needed some kind of a break.
Yeah.
And as a kid who couldn't have named a ton of Phish songs, like I got a bounce and I got one that I knew. That was fun. But yeah, like you're right. Even the dog faced boy, like had they played it a little more like they do in the recorded version, that would have been a little bit of a breather. And I don't know if that was what they expected it to be, but like I wouldn't consider it one. It was a moving dog faced boy.
And then they do close the set with Character Zero after Bouncing Around the Room, which is a perfect set closer. And at a minute 45, I don't know the reaction I'll get from you or from anyone who listens to this, but it becomes much slower than what I'm used to with Character Zero. And I can't believe these words were typed out by me. I wrote, "This is as if Bob Weir were in charge of Phish's tempo."
I hear you. So in the like mid 2000s or so, or somewhere in the 2010s, I just started like I felt like, well, no, it must have been earlier. Like for a while, it felt like Character Zero was a great set two closer, and they did it a lot. And then it's like this is no longer a great set two closer. It was cool to see them still. I agree. Like it was definitely. I don't know if I'd use the Bob Weir comparison, but I hear what you're saying. Just like some of the other tunes were a little fast, this one was a little bit slow. And like, hey, seeing them do a Character Zero like this nowadays would just be cool because even when you think about Fall '97, you're not thinking about Character Zero, and to the extent you are, you're not thinking about it this way. Again, it's just cool to hear like different versions of these sorts of songs or different approaches to these sorts of songs or to these
Yeah.
songs.
And they go off stage, of course. They come back on for the encore made up of Ginseng Sullivan, which is typical Phish bluegrass, a fun clap along for everyone. And they close the whole show with Sample in a Jar.
Yeah. And I mean, they're not to say there's no better closer, but like Sample's on the Mount Rushmore as far as I'm concerned. I'm sure newer fans than me will probably say I'm a 1.0 old head, and they may not be wrong. I mean, I was hooked, not hooked enough to go to 300 shows or whatever over 30 years, but like I was just fully in. It's like, okay, this is one of my bands now. Like they did it. I don't know what they did, but they got me there. And that was just amazing. And like I love seeing how these songs continue to kind of manifest and what they mean to me and what they mean to fans and what they mean to the band. You look at the legacy of, say, the Dead, with things like J-Rad and what other folks are doing now. It's cool to see Phish have so many different evolutions and changes like that. You've got a band like Reprise now that's out there, kind of recreating it in a way that like a Dark Star or J-Rad does. Like, it's just cool to me to see people like you and me who were fans and going to these shows at the time now, all grown up and doing this certainly much better than I could. I won't speak for you because I know you are an excellent drummer, but the jams were what kind of got me in. But the songbook and also seeing what other talented people kind of think of it and do with it, that's just really, really cool. Yeah, I think the songs may be what I appreciate most about them and a lot of other bands now as compared with the jams. So like it's about the songs, yeah, and the platform that they can provide for other people to do different kinds of improvisation that is not a Phish thing, but that's great. Like, take it and make it your own. I love it.
Well, Matt, thank you for coming today onto Attendance Bias to talk about a whole hell of a lot, but centered on December 2nd, 1997 at the Spectrum in Philadelphia, a venue, sadly, that's been gone for a while, but that we were lucky enough to attend and experience, and a show that is at, to your point, not only just the peak of Phish's career, but a big transitional time of their career. And it's really fun to look back and recognize it, even though at the time it seemed like a big party, which it was, but also to go back and see where it fits within the larger scheme. So thank you for that conversation today.
Oh, my pleasure. I really had a lot of fun with this, Brian. Thank you.
And that's it for today's conversation with Matt Hoffman, but we were playing pretty fast and loose, so we got to make sure we got everything right with the attendance bias fact check.
Attendance bias fact check.
First, the Philadelphia Spectrum was demolished in sequences, beginning in November 2010 and finishing in May 2011. The weirdest thing Matt had ever seen between Phish shows was when he and his friends drove straight from Camden to Coventry in August 2004. I brought it up but didn't quite explain it, but after the encore at that Camden show, Trey announced that anyone who was planning to go straight to Coventry should wait until Saturday morning since the rain had delayed entry to the festival. Most people who heard that message, I guess, did not take Trey's advice, and the traffic built up to legendary proportions, although that probably would have happened no matter what Trey said at the time. The version of Yamar that Matt describes, where Trey sort of conducts different band member duets in the jam, happened on July 10th, 1997 at, forgive my pronunciation, Espace Julien in Marseille, France. The extended version of Choctaws Torture from Camden that Matt references was played on July 10th, 1999. Often cited as one of the best versions of the song, it has been covered on Attendance Bias with guest Adam Rosenberg. Matt and I briefly discussed the band's 4-show 20th anniversary run in November in 2003. Matt erroneously referred to it as the 30th anniversary. But he did bring up the Philadelphia show on November 29th of that year, which I was not a fan of, and then he mentioned the 20-year anniversary video. That video was actually played 2 nights later at the Fleet Center in Boston. And that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Matt Hoffman for joining me today, Phish.net for its help with the fact check, the Mockingbird Foundation for everything they do to support music education for students, and Phish.in for the recording used in today's episode. And thank you for listening. If you enjoy Attendance Bias, please support the show by visiting www.buymeacoffee.com/attendance bias and donating anything you can. You can also follow Attendance Bias on social media. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next week on Attendance Bias.